Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time, William Hardee fought the Mexican War and developed a manual for light infantry tactics that would greatly impact the United States military. Now we move into the Civil War with Hardee. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. Join the Patreon page and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The slavery question increased tensions in the Western territories, particularly Kansas. The military was called into that proposed state to deal with the war developing between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in Kansas, as well as the Native Americans rising up in the western part of the territory. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis chomped at the bit years earlier to bring more units, particularly cavalry units, into the United States Army, and in 1855, two new regiments were created, the 1st and 2nd U.S. Cavalry. Hardee requested a position in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry and was granted it, making him a major. In 1855, Hardee was on the Cavalry Equipment Board, and he helped develop and promote a hat known as the Hardee hat for the cavalry to wear that protected them from the sun, as opposed to the caps that offered little protection. It was quickly adopted for the cavalry, but soon all branches of the Army wore the hat. The 2nd U.S. Cavalry was commanded by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, and some of his officers included Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, Major George H. Thomas, Captains Earl Van Dorn, Edmund Kirby Smith, George Stoneman, and Lieutenant John Bell Hood, to name a few. Smith remarked that Lee was the most accomplished officer and gentleman in the Army, and regarded Hardee as the model drill and duty officer of the mounted service. Another member of the regiment thought that Hardee was a man of less stability of character than Albert Sidney Johnston or Robert E. Lee, but he was better fitted than either to set up a regiment or a large command. He was a man of affairs and of talent and industry, and temperate in his habits. There were old officers who considered him overambitious. Hardee went to Jefferson Barracks outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and found that the 2nd Cavalry was destined for Texas. Native Americans had increased raids when troops stationed in Texas went to Kansas. With Johnston and Lee sitting on a court-martial at Fort Leavenworth, it was up to Hardee to equip and train the men for Texas. As temporary commander of the regiment, he led them from Jefferson Barracks to Texas, arriving at Fort Mason in January 1856, but Hardee and a few companies would create a semi-permanent camp on the Clear Fork of the Brazos River, called Camp Cooper. The companies and Hardee suffered through the horrible winter months at Camp Cooper with very little shelter or provisions, because their overall commander in Texas hadn't prepared for the cavalry's arrival. The health of the regiment improved by the spring, and in April, Lee returned to take command of the unit at Camp Cooper, while Hardee went to Fort Mason. In June 1856, Hardee was notified that he needed to come to West Point, that he would be made the commandant of the Corps of Cadets. The position of commandant changed when Hardee was appointed to that position. Jefferson Davis wanted the commandant to retain disciplinary control over the Corps of Cadets, but he also wished to consolidate the tactical branches of instruction into one department headed by this officer. Thus, in July 1856, Davis issued the order giving the commandant these duties. He also provided him with 6 junior officers as assistants. Some of these assistants were Oliver Otis Howard, John Pegram, John Schofield, Charles Field, Cadmus Wilcox, Edward Porter Alexander, and Alexander McCook. Hardee was a strict disciplinarian, but he also instituted amusements for the cadets, like dances held 3 nights a week during the summer encampment. He also created new courses including military law, equitation, and veterinary science. He also pushed for historical studies as well as Spanish, which he thought of better value to the cadets than French. The bond between Davis and Hardee grew as the two worked increasingly closer together. Hardee invited the Secretary of War and his wife Varina to West Point regularly, and whenever Hardee was in Washington, he called on Davis. While in the capital, Hardee became a socialite, with him being invited to multiple parties. The witty conversationalist made friends easily, and he even dined with President James Buchanan. The ladies of Washington competed for his affection as well, intrigued by the respected military man. Hardee wrote teasing and flirtatious letters to his lady friends. Clara Page stands out as one he wrote to that exhibits his flirty behavior. He wrote, "West Point was never more pleasant, except when you are here, than it is at present. The weather has been beautiful and the company charming. I spent the last 2 evenings at Cousin's Hotel, where I have 2 or 3 sweethearts, Miss B of Philadelphia is decidedly the most attractive girl, save one, I have met this summer. One of Hardee's favorite things to do was to go to Gouverneur Kimball's home at Cold Springs, New York, for Saturday afternoon dinners. Guests would include Winfield Scott, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Dennis Hart Mahan, and former President Martin Van Buren. All wasn't parties and flirtations with Hardee. When he became Commandant of Cadets, he moved his children with him to West Point, along with their aunt, his sister-in-law, Anna, who everyone called Dina. It's been speculated by historians that Hardee loved her, but couldn't marry her because she was still an English citizen, and under English common law, she couldn't marry her brother-in-law. He wrote about her in letters frequently, lovingly, and respectfully, and she moved to West Point to take care of the children whom she adored. The children of the officers at West Point created havoc for the cadets, particularly Hardee's son, William. The children would mock the plebes, throwing things at them, and pull general pranks on them. When the cadets could catch the children without their parents around, they would rub their faces in the snow and get some small amounts of retribution. In 1860, Hardee knew his time as commandant was coming to an end, and he planned to leave in the summer of that year. In July, he visited the Virginia Military Institute, drilled its cadets at the summer encampment that the cadets named for Hardee, and the school officials came to Hardee and offered him a faculty position, but he declined because of the small salary. He returned to West Point and was notified of his new orders. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel of the 1st Cavalry, and he was to join them in Texas in February 1861. The 7 months between these orders and his return to Texas was to be taken as leave. In September, he officially left West Point and the position of commandant, to be succeeded by John F. Reynolds of Pennsylvania. The students wouldn't forget him, though. One student recalled, "I stood in the presence of Colonel Hardee as he sat at his desk, pen in hand, dressed in uniform, his handsome face turned toward me, his dark eyes seemingly full of kindness. I thought I never beheld a finer specimen of manhood. Tall and slender, he looked every inch a soldier. He spoke words of encouragement, and when I passed, he was pleased and asked me how I was getting on, thereby showing the contrasting kindness toward me, as between the commandant and the superintendent, yet the one was from the north and the other from the south. When Colonel Hardee left the point for other duty, I felt as though I had lost my best friend." The end of 1861 was chaotic for the country and likewise for Hardee, who actually worked for the state of Georgia while on leave. Joseph Brown, the governor of Georgia, employed Hardee to accumulate ammunition and weapons for the state of Georgia in the event of secession. Hardee even contemplated going to Europe to look for weapons to purchase if the War Department had allowed that travel. During Hardee's time working for Brown, he declined the position as State Adjutant General. On January 19, 1861, Georgia seceded from the Union, and Hardee knew he would follow his state. In regard to secession and the Confederacy, Hardee wrote to his friend Edmund Kirby Smith that, "Florida and Georgia, our native states, have both seceded, and I feel confident that we are destined to have a Southern Confederacy. I do not think there is any probability of a compromise being made which will cause the scattered fragments to reunite again. Under these circumstances, an all-important question presents itself: at what time shall we resign? The state of Florida has passed a resolution inviting the officers of the Army and Navy to return to the service of the state with the same rank and same pay which they at present receive from the general government. A similar resolution has been introduced in the Georgia legislature, but it has not been acted on. It may or may not pass. Whether it does or not, I consider that Georgia has a paramount claim on my allegiance, and I have written to the governor of the state to say that I am ready to resign whenever he may need my services, or whenever, in his judgment, it may be proper for me to do so. I am awaiting his reply, and I shall be governed by what he recommends. I am sure you feel as I do about sustaining the South, but your case is somewhat different from mine. The Florida resolution required all officers desirous of serving the state to signify their intentions to do so within 30 days. This, with you, is impossible. Unless, therefore, a collision of arms takes place before a Southern Confederacy is organized, I don't think I would resign. There is no immediate need of your services. You are out of the way, and you will not be forgotten when a Southern army is organized. To remain on the frontier, I think, would be my course of action. But much must depend on the state of your feelings. There is no probability that you will be called on to act against the South, and this should be duly considered in making up your decision. If I thought your failure to resign now would interfere with your appointment in the Southern Confederacy, I would recommend you resign immediately, but I don't believe it will." 6 days after writing this letter to Smith, Hardee resigned from the Army, joining the state of Georgia. The next day he received Special Order No. 21 from the War Department, dictating that all officers return to their units. Hardee replied that he had already submitted his resignation before the order came to him, and asked the War Department to accept it. The War Department telegraphed him on February 7, 1861, saying, "Resignation accepted, January 31st, 1861. On that same day, February 7th, Hardee was chosen to lead one of 2 regiments authorized by Georgia's Secession Convention. He would command the 1st Regiment, and William H.T. Walker would command the 2nd Regiment. Hardee began to assemble his regiment in Savannah, Georgia, all the while sitting on a board to determine the uniform and equipment of Georgia troops, establish the Georgia Navy, and assist in getting supplies. He did this as the Confederacy was being formed in Montgomery, Alabama. 2 weeks after Jefferson Davis became president of the Confederacy, Hardee offered his services to that government and was called to Montgomery to work on the Army bill with Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. For several weeks, Hardee advised Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker on establishing an army. On March 7th, Walker offered Hardee a colonelcy in the Confederate Provisional Army, and Hardee resigned from the Georgia military to take that position. His first assignment was to command the garrison at Fort Morgan on the Alabama coast and train the new recruits, which Hardee found was a Herculean task. His assignment was soon expanded to incorporate the approaches to Mobile as well. In the border states, particularly Missouri, Union forces began taking full control of significant armories and factories like in St. Louis. The Confederate situation looked bleak, and factionalism like in Arkansas reigned, so much so that an Arkansas citizen wrote to the Secretary of War to send someone not associated with any of the factions in the state to help rally their military against the Union. The Secretary chose Hardee for the job. On July 3, 1861, Hardee arrived in Memphis, Tennessee, on his way to Little Rock. There he met some people who would be important to him. One was Felicia Shover, the widow of one of his old Army friends, who would correspond with him during the war, and the other was Samuel Tate, the president of the important Memphis and Charleston Railroad, and who became one of Hardee's biggest supporters. A few days later, he and his regiment of Arkansans under Thomas C. Heineman set off for Little Rock, where Hardee oversaw the transfer of Arkansas troops to Confederate service. Many Arkansans felt that if they entered Confederate service, they would be sent east to the Appalachian Mountains and leave Arkansas unprotected. Many left and went home rather than enter Confederate service. Hardee acted quickly and sent the influential Heineman into the camps to encourage men to stay and join the Confederacy. While in Arkansas, Hardee found a true friend in his subordinate Patrick Cleburne. Cleburne was born in Ireland, but immigrated to the United States, settling in Helena, Arkansas. He commanded the 9th Arkansas in Hardee's new brigade, and the two became close friends. When it was decided for the Confederate forces of Arkansas and Missouri to invade Missouri, mismanagement and egos got in the way, preventing the forces from linking up to make a concentrated effort to invade the state. Hardee wasn't blameless. He either couldn't or wouldn't unite with the forces in southwestern Missouri, who fought and won the Battle of Wilson's Creek on August 10th. There was no overall commander there, and the general with the requisite rank, Leonidas Polk, never left his headquarters. Meanwhile, Hardee drilled his troops, taking over the instruction of his soldiers personally. A soldier who saw Hardee in this early stage of war commented, "General Hardee was a thoroughly educated and exceedingly accomplished soldier. No one in the old army, perhaps, was more perfectly versed in either the more important or the minutest details of professional knowledge. He believed in careful discipline and was sometimes strict in enforcing its essentials, but he was never harsh, and was not only solicitous for the comfort of his men, but entertained the kindest of feeling for them. He was a handsome man of a very striking figure and extremely courteous and pleasant in manner." Hardee could see how the war was beginning to progress from his vantage point in the Trans-Mississippi West. He wrote to Felicia Shover that, "I am particularly desirous to bring my command to the other side of the Mississippi. It is there, in my opinion, the great battles for our independence must be fought, and in these I wish to participate. I am desirous also that General Sidney Johnston should be sent to command in the valley of the Mississippi. He has more experience than General Polk and will inspire greater confidence." Albert Sidney Johnston took command of the forces that Hardee wished he would, and set up a defensive line from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River through Kentucky, with his right flank anchored at Cumberland Gap, his left flank anchored at Columbus, Kentucky, and his center at Bowling Green, Kentucky. Johnston needed Hardee's brigade in Kentucky and ordered him across the Mississippi River. Hardee got to Columbus on October 6th, but Johnston needed him to reinforce his center at Bowling Green. At Russellville, Kentucky, the citizens clamored to see the famous Hardee. The general came out on the train platform and said, "I am no speaking man. If I were, the time for speaking has passed. The sword is the only argument. I believe you are in earnest in the cause, and hope to see every one of you on the road soon, with your knapsacks on your back and your gun on your shoulder." At Bowling Green, Hardee threw out his regiments to counter the thrust by Federal troops southward. Both sides were uneasy in this early stage of the war, and Hardee's light pressure against Union soldiers convinced the enemy to withdraw. Soon after Hardee's movement, he was promoted to Major General and given command of a division. He organized his division and named his 3 brigade commanders. He chose Thomas Hindman, Patrick Claiborne, and Robert Shaver. For his division, Hardee designed a flag for them to carry to identify them on the battlefield, containing a silver or white full moon on a blue field. One of his secretaries wrote about Hardee that the general is occupied every moment, giving audience, hearing grievances, regulating irregularities, etc. He never denies himself, not even to the humblest private in the ranks, and by consequence, he is very much beloved by all the soldiers, high and low, and can count on them with confidence when the conflict comes. The military situation in Kentucky was one of rumors and bluffing. Phantom armies appeared in reports that never materialized in front of combatants. Hardee perused these reports and made adjustments to his lines as needed, but there was a real threat in eastern Kentucky. George H. Thomas, the Virginian, and at one time a subordinate of Hardee in the 2nd Cavalry, was threatening Johnston and Hardee's right flank by moving toward the Tennessee line. Hardee wrote about the situation. "My own feeble voice, if called on, will be to pursue and fight, march rapidly, whip the enemy, then turn back and give battle to the foe which may be in front. In war, much is gained by activity. Napoleon used to say he gained more victories by the legs of his soldiers than by their bayonets. I am glad the responsibility does not rest with me. It is weighty, and I would not bear it if I could." Like always, Hardee required the strict training and drill of his soldiers. Claiborne took to it quickly, with Hindman not as confident in his abilities. Hardee also ordered his brigades to march and sometimes conduct a forced march to towns in Kentucky in order to toughen up the men. This training exercise had an unintended brilliant effect. Reports of the Confederate movements to Union commanders scared them, thinking that it precipitated a general advance by the Confederate forces. The result was that Union commanders were ordered to withdraw from their advanced positions. Hardee's mind wasn't always on the enemy in his front. He worried about his children and St. Augustine. Union forces threatened the town. He wrote, "What are we to do should this atrocious war continue 15 months longer unless the blockade be raised? I dislike to look the future in the face. It looks to me lowering and dark. God in His mercy may bring us deliverance, and I hope will." As the winter months set in, operations were less frequent. The soldiers and Hardee settled into winter quarters, with Hardee regularly inviting ladies to his headquarters and entertaining them. One soldier recounts one of Hardee's evenings. "Last evening, General H. was here, and we were teasing him about the number of lady visitors he was honored with at his house, for you must know he is the ladies' man among the officers here. When he told us quite an amusing incident, or rather smart speech, of a Miss Bang of Nashville, who was here a few days ago. It seems Hardee and other officers at his headquarters had been very attentive to her and the party that was with her. When she was going away and taking leave of all, he kissed her hand, when she said, 'General, you did that so sweetly, you should teach your aide.' The idea with her being probably this, that such gallantry would better become younger men, but he did not so understand her." In January 1862, the first event occurred that handed the Confederates a string of defeats. Union General George Thomas defeated Confederate General Felix Zollicoffer at the Battle of Mill Springs. Then in February, Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured Forts Henry and Donelson. After Fort Henry fell, a council of war was called at Bowling Green, with Hardee, Johnston, and the newly arrived Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard present. It was decided that they would evacuate Bowling Green and pull back to Nashville. By February 14th, at 3:30 p.m., Hardee had fully evacuated Bowling Green and headed south. In Nashville, the Confederate Army found panicked civilians, who grew even more panicked when they realized the Confederate Army wasn't going to defend Nashville. Indeed, Hardee and the rest of the soldiers were to evacuate the capital and move to Murfreesboro. Johnston assigned Hardee the task of evacuating the important equipment in government stores. Irate Nashvillians came to the general's headquarters and demanded him to come out and explain what was happening. Hardee placated them the best he could, and they dispersed. From Nashville to Murfreesboro, Hardee heard the grumblings of civilians and soldiers alike, criticizing Johnston for withdrawing so quickly. Hardee attempted to quiet them down, but from his personal letters he seems to have kept some reservations about the Commandant General. He wrote to Miss Shover that, "I forbear to write about our movement from Nashville in our present condition. In my judgment, nothing can save us except the presence of the President, who ought to come here, assume command, and call on people to rally to his standard. We have lost Kentucky and may lose Tennessee. I don't despair of our cause. If we can make head against the villains until May, we are safe. I have been more broken down in the last 10 days than at any other time in my life. This is the darkest hour of my fortune." The army kept marching south, and at Shelbyville, Tennessee, Hardee encountered the pro-Unionist East Tennessean Parson William Brownlow. Brownlow had a pass from the War Department that would allow him through the Confederate lines, but Hardee wouldn't let him pass, saying his presence at Nashville would be extremely prejudicial to our cause, ordering him to go to Alabama or Mississippi. Brownlow called Hardee a humbug of an officer and went along his way. Hardee exhibited his cavalry background in his employment of John Hunt Morgan. Starting with his time in Kentucky, Hardee utilized Morgan to harass the enemy and screen the army's movements. Hardee used Morgan's talents in Tennessee as well, like destroying the bridges along the route that the Federals would take in pursuit of the Confederate Army, and delaying the enemy long enough for Hardee to orchestrate the removal of supplies from various points along the way. Hardee would be one of Morgan's biggest supporters and urged the Confederacy to promote him. Because of the turn of events in the Western theater, troops from across the South began to concentrate at Corinth, Mississippi. Hardee moved his troops there as well. These troops weren't all well disciplined, and some of it stemmed from their commanders. Hardee was ordered to Iuka, not far from Corinth, to investigate the troops there. What Hardee found horrified him. He placed 2 generals under arrest, George Crittenden and William Carroll. Both of them were arrested for drunkenness and other offenses. At Corinth, this new body of men began to take shape and become an army. Johnston, with the help of Beauregard, the newly arrived Braxton Bragg, and Hardee, worked to turn the various units into a solid fighting force to combat the Federal troops of Ulysses S. Grant coming up the Tennessee River.